black man. A late-night traffic stop. A cop with his hand on his gun. But what happens when the man they're profiling isn't just another statistic? He's a judge. This is more than just a routine stop. It's a battle for dignity, justice, and the truth America refuses to face. Stay with us. Because this story changes everything. The late evening sun cast long shadows over the quiet suburban road as Judge Marcus Carter guided his sleek, black sedan through the streets toward home. He had spent the entire day presiding over cases, listening to arguments, and making difficult decisions that impacted people's lives. His mind was still lingering on one particular case. A young black man who had been unfairly targeted by the system, accused of a crime with flimsy evidence. Marcus had done what he could within the confines of the law, but deep inside, he knew that justice was not always blind. As he approached an intersection, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror. A sigh escaped his lips as he glanced down at his speedometer. He hadn't been speeding. His seatbelt was fastened. He had signaled properly. There was no reason he should be getting pulled over. Yet there he was. With a deep breath, he pulled his car to the side of the road, his mind already preparing for the usual routine. Hands on the wheel. No sudden movements. Calm demeanor. It was a dance he had rehearsed too many times before, despite his status, despite his title. He knew that to the officer approaching his vehicle, he was just another black man in a nice car, nothing more. A sharp knock on the window signaled the beginning of what Marcus already knew would be an unpleasant encounter. He rolled the window down and found himself looking at a stern-faced white officer with a rigid stance and an unmistakable air of authority. The officer leaned down slightly, peering into the car before speaking. License and registration, the officer demanded, his tone clipped and unfriendly. Marcus nodded, keeping his hands visible as he spoke. Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped? You can ask after you hand over your license and registration. The officer replied, his hand resting lightly on the grip of his holstered firearm. Marcus felt the familiar churn of frustration in his stomach but remained composed. He had encountered men like this before. Officers who saw blackness as a threat, who thrived on power, who assumed the worst before even asking the first question. Slowly, he reached for his wallet and retrieved his identification, handing it over with practiced patience. The officer snatched it from his hand and examined it, his eyes flicking back and forth between Marcus's face and the name on the license. Something in his expression shifted slightly, a flicker of recognition, but it was gone just as fast. Step out of the vehicle, the officer ordered, stepping back slightly. Marcus inhaled sharply. Is there a reason for this, officer? He glanced at the name tag. Mitchell. You fit the description of someone we're looking for, Mitchell replied vaguely. Marcus didn't believe that for a second. It was the oldest excuse in the book. Still, he knew better than to argue on the side of the road. With slow, deliberate movements, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, maintaining eye contact with the officer. Mitchell immediately took a step closer, his presence looming. Hands on the car, he instructed. Officer, I'm Judge Marcus Carter, he said firmly. I serve on the Superior Court. I would appreciate it if you treated me with the same level of respect I have given you. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. I don't care if you're the mayor. You do what I say, or I'll have to assume you're resisting. There it was. The veiled threat. The unspoken warning that any hesitation, any challenge to his authority, could be met with force. Marcus could feel his pulse quicken. But he remained steady. He had seen this play out before too many times in too many courtrooms. He was not about to become another statistic. I am complying, Marcus said evenly, placing his hands on the roof of his car. Mitchell patted him down roughly, more forceful than necessary, as though searching for a reason to escalate the situation. Finding nothing, he stepped back, muttering under his breath. The tension in the air was thick, the kind that could snap at any second. A second police car pulled up, and another officer stepped out, a younger man who seemed surprised to see what was unfolding. He exchanged a quick look with Mitchell before glancing at Marcus. Everything okay here? The younger officer asked. Mitchell ignored him and turned back to Marcus. Where are you headed tonight? Marcus exhaled slowly. Home. After work. I assume I am free to go now. Mitchell hesitated. He had already lost control of the situation. The younger officer seemed to recognize Marcus's name, his expression shifting into something close to recognition. Judge Carter? He asked, looking between them. Marcus nodded. That's right. The Mitchell's jaw clenched. He knew he had made a mistake. He knew that whatever authority he thought he held over this black man in a nice car had just evaporated. The realization settled into his features, but instead of apologizing, he simply handed back the license with a stiff nod. Drive safe, he muttered. Marcus took his license, meeting Mitchell's gaze with an expression that held years of restrained anger, years of knowing exactly what had just happened and why. He opened his car door and slid inside, his fingers gripping the wheel tightly before he finally exhaled. As he pulled back onto the road, his reflection in the rearview mirror looked back at him. Tired, frustrated, but unsurprised. This wasn't new. It wasn't shocking. It wasn't even the worst encounter he had ever had. But that didn't make it any less infuriating. The flashing lights disappeared behind him as he drove away, but the weight of the moment lingered. He had spent his career upholding the law, believing in justice, yet here he was, reminded again that for some, justice was conditional. And for men like Officer Mitchell, power was too often wielded without accountability. Marcus Carter stood on the side of the road, his hands resting lightly on the roof of his car, feeling the heat of the metal beneath his fingertips. The flashing red and blue lights from the squad car painted the night in an eerie glow, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly down the empty street. Officer Brad Mitchell stood behind him, posture rigid, hand hovering near his holstered weapon. Even though Marcus had done everything by the book, kept his hands visible, spoken calmly, followed instructions, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Mitchell had already made up his mind about him. Marcus could see it in his eyes, in the way his lips curled slightly in irritation every time Marcus spoke. The badge on Mitchell's chest gave him power, but it was the kind of power that wasn't about upholding justice. It was about control. Marcus had seen men like him in his courtroom before, officers who had escalated situations that should have been routine, men who viewed blackness as something inherently suspicious, inherently dangerous. It was infuriating, but it was also exhausting. "I need you to turn around and face me," Mitchell ordered, his voice sharp, commanding. Marcus moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his movements measured. He met Mitchell's gaze, his own steady, unwavering. "Officer, I have complied with every instruction you've given me. I am Judge Marcus Carter. If you check my identification, you'll see that I serve on the Superior Court. Now, I'd appreciate it if you could tell me why I'm being detained." Mitchell's expression didn't change. He glanced down at the license he still held in his hand but made no move to verify it. Instead, he took a step closer, closing the small distance between them. "I don't care who you are," he said coldly. "What I care about is that you fit the description of someone we're looking for." The Marcus held back the sigh that threatened to escape his lips. The vague "fits the description" excuse was one he had heard too many times before. It was the justification officers used when they had no real reason to stop someone but needed to cover themselves when questioned later. He knew exactly how this game was played. If he resisted, even verbally, it would be labeled as non-compliance. If he demanded more information, he could be accused of obstruction. So he remained composed. "Officer, I find that hard to believe," Marcus said evenly. "You haven't even run my plates or checked my information. I have done absolutely nothing to warrant this level of suspicion. You pulled me over without cause, ordered me out of my vehicle, and are now detaining me without explanation. This is not just inappropriate, it's illegal." Mitchell's nostrils flared slightly, his jaw tightening. He wasn't used to being challenged. He was used to people backing down, afraid of what would happen if they didn't. He was used to dictating the terms of every encounter. But Marcus wasn't backing down. "You watch your tone," Mitchell warned, shifting his weight slightly, as if daring Marcus to step out of line. Marcus exhaled slowly. "My tone is measured. My words are precise. What I'm asking for is a legitimate explanation, something I am entitled to as a citizen and as someone who upholds the law daily." A second squad car pulled up to the scene, its tires crunching against the pavement. Another officer, younger, with a more uncertain expression, stepped out. His eyes flickered between Marcus and Mitchell, assessing the situation. "What's going on here?" the younger officer asked, his tone less aggressive, more inquisitive. Mitchell didn't break eye contact with Marcus as he responded. "Routine stop. Just making sure everything checks out." Marcus glanced at the younger officer, noticing the hesitation in his stance, the slight shift in his demeanor when he recognized Marcus's name. "Judge Carter," the younger officer asked, his brow furrowing. He looked back at Mitchell. "You know who this is, right?" Mitchell's grip on Marcus's license tightened slightly. "Yeah, I know," he said, though his tone betrayed the fact that he hadn't actually known. And now that he did, he was caught in a corner. The younger officer hesitated for a beat, then glanced at Marcus. "Sir, are you okay?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was in a way okay. He was not hurt, not physically. But was he okay with the fact that this had happened at all? That if he weren't a judge, if he were just an ordinary black man driving home, this could have ended very differently. That Mitchell, given the chance, might have escalated this even further. "I'd like to know if I'm free to go," Marcus finally said, his voice carefully controlled. Mitchell's eyes flicked to the younger officer, his irritation barely contained. He didn't want to back down, but now that the situation was being scrutinized by his colleague, he had no choice. He shoved Marcus's license back into his hand. "Drive safe," he muttered, the words bitter, forced. Marcus took his license, meeting Mitchell's gaze with an unreadable expression. He wanted to say something more, something that would hold Mitchell accountable in a way that a viral video or an internal complaint never truly would. But he knew better. The battle wasn't here, on this street, in this moment. The battle was bigger than that. Without another word, he turned, slid back into his car, and pulled away, the weight of what had just happened settling in his chest like a stone. He had spent years fighting for justice, believing in the power of the law. But in that moment, as he drove away from flashing lights and the ghost of something that could have turned deadly, he was reminded of a painful truth. Justice was not blind. and some men, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could never truly see beyond their own prejudice. The video spread faster than Marcus Carter could have imagined. It started with a single clip, shaky and grainy, captured by a bystander who had the presence of mind to record the traffic stop. The footage was short, just a few minutes, but it showed everything. The flashing police lights illuminating Marcus's composed but clearly frustrated face. Officer Mitchell standing stiffly, hand hovering over his weapon, his posture tense with unspoken hostility. The way he dismissed Marcus's identification, ignoring his status as a judge. The moment another officer arrived and recognized Marcus, diffusing the situation but not erasing what had already happened. Within hours, the video was circulating on social media, captioned with phrases like, "Judge or not," and "Black men aren't safe," and "Power means nothing when you're profiled." Marcus had seen countless stories like this unfold before. He had presided over cases where traffic stops escalated into violence, where black men who had done nothing wrong ended up in handcuffs, or worse. He had watched protests erupt over incidents just like this one, seen the outrage swell and fade with the next news cycle. But this time, he was at the center of it. News outlets picked up the story, some focusing on the systemic issue of racial profiling, others framing it as yet another misunderstanding between law enforcement and civilians. Conservative commentators tried to downplay the situation, questioning whether Marcus had been cooperative enough. Others pointed to the fact that he hadn't been harmed, implying that there was no real issue. But the overwhelming response from the public was clear. This was not just an isolated incident. This was a reflection of a system that saw blackness as a threat, no matter the title, the education, or the achievements behind it. The police department was quick to release a statement. It was the kind of carefully worded damage control Marcus had seen before, an attempt to quiet the storm without actually addressing the real issue. "We take all allegations of misconduct seriously, and are reviewing the incident to ensure that department policies were followed. We value our relationship with the community and remain committed to fairness and accountability." It was nothing more than a hollow gesture, a way to deflect responsibility. There was no mention of Officer Mitchell's history, no acknowledgement that racial profiling was at play, no real commitment to change. Just empty words meant to pacify the public. Meanwhile, Marcus's inbox was flooded with messages, some from colleagues expressing their support, some from strangers sharing their own experiences, and others from those who saw him as a threat. The hate mail came swiftly, filled with accusations that he was playing the race card, that he should have been more respectful to the officer, that he was trying to divide the country. Some messages were even more sinister, filled with veiled threats and racial slurs. Despite everything, Marcus refused to stay silent. He granted interviews, spoke on panels, and used his platform to highlight the deeper issue at play. He wasn't just a judge who had been racially profiled. He was a black man who had spent his career upholding a legal system that often failed people who looked like him. During a televised interview, a journalist asked him, "Do you think Officer Mitchell should be fired?" And Marcus took a measured breath before responding. "This isn't just about one officer. It's about a culture that allows officers like him to act with impunity. If he were to lose his job, another officer with the same mindset could replace him tomorrow. What needs to change is the system that enables this kind of behavior. There has to be real accountability, real training, real consequences. Otherwise, we'll be having this same conversation next month, next year, and 10 years from now." The interview went viral, shared across platforms with comments ranging from admiration to vitriol. Some praised Marcus for his composure, while others accused him of inciting division. But Marcus wasn't deterred. He had spent too many years believing that change was only possible within the courtroom, only to realize that the fight was much bigger than that. Under pressure, the police department announced that Officer Mitchell had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. It was the classic move, a temporary measure meant to appease the public while quietly waiting for the outrage to die down. Marcus had seen it happen before. He knew how these investigations usually played out. The officer would claim he felt threatened. The department would conclude that no policies were violated, and in a few months Mitchell would be back on the job, emboldened by the lack of consequences. But this time, things were different. The protests outside the police station weren't fading. Community leaders were calling for independent oversight. The district attorney hinted at potential legal action. The case wasn't disappearing into the usual cycle of outrage and forgetfulness. It was gaining momentum. One evening, Marcus received an unexpected call from a senior official at City Hall. "Judge Carter, we'd like to meet with you to discuss possible reforms." Marcus had spent years advocating for change within the system, but this was the first time he felt like his voice was truly being heard beyond the courtroom. He wasn't naive. He knew that political leaders often responded to pressure rather than principle. But if there was even a small chance to turn this moment into something meaningful, he had to take it. As he sat in his office, reading through the latest headlines and messages, Marcus knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just about him. It was about every black man who had ever been pulled over for no reason, every mother who had to have the talk, with her son about how to survive a police encounter. Every person who had been told to just comply, as if compliance had ever been a guarantee of safety. The backlash was fierce, but so was the support. The truth had been exposed, and now, Marcus had to decide how far he was willing to push for the change he had always believed in. The courtroom was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of a pen against the wooden bench where Judge Marcus Carter sat. He wasn't presiding today. He was here as a witness, a plaintiff in a case that had unfolded in a way he never expected. Across the aisle, Officer Brad Mitchell sat with his attorney, his face an unreadable mask. The man who had once held power over Marcus during that late night traffic stop now found himself at the center of a legal storm. The city had been forced to take action after the video of the stop went viral. Protests had erupted outside the police station. Community leaders had demanded accountability. National news had picked up the story, putting pressure on city officials who could no longer afford to turn a blind eye. The mayor, desperate to calm the growing outrage, had promised a full investigation. But Marcus had seen how these things played out before. Promises were easy to make, harder to keep. Officer Mitchell had been placed on administrative leave, a predictable first step. But would it lead to actual consequences, or would the system, as it so often did, protect its own? That was the question weighing heavily on Marcus's mind as he listened to the proceedings. The police department's internal investigation had been swift, too swift. Within a few weeks, their official report concluded that Mitchell had acted within department guidelines. He had suspected Marcus of criminal activity. He had feared for his safety. The phrases were infuriatingly familiar, the same justification used time and time again to excuse excessive force and racial profiling. But this time, there was a problem. The public wasn't buying it. The video evidence was clear. Mitchell had ignored Marcus's judicial credentials, escalated the situation unnecessarily, and only backed down when another officer intervened. The city's own watchdog group issued a report contradicting the department's findings, stating that the stop had no legal basis and was a clear case of racial profiling. Faced with mounting public pressure, the district attorney had been forced to step in, and now Marcus found himself in an unfamiliar position, on the other side of the bench, testifying about his own experience with injustice. His attorney stood and approached the witness stand. "Judge Carter, can you describe the events of that evening in your own words?" Marcus leaned slightly forward, his voice steady but firm. "I was driving home after work, obeying all traffic laws. I was pulled over without reason. When I asked the officer why I was being stopped, he refused to answer. Instead, he ordered me out of the car and physically searched me despite my repeated identification as a judge. Did Officer Mitchell ever provide a clear reason for the stop?" "No," Marcus said, shaking his head. "He claimed I fit a description, but never specified what that description was. He didn't check my plates or verify my information until a second officer arrived." The defense attorney stood, adjusting his tie. "Judge Carter, isn't it true that police officers have broad discretion to conduct stops in the interest of public safety?" Marcus met his gaze evenly. "Discretion is not a license for discrimination. A traffic stop must be based on reasonable suspicion, not personal bias. Officer Mitchell never had reasonable suspicion, only assumptions based on the color of my skin." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney cleared his throat. "But you were not physically harmed, correct?" Marcus inhaled deeply, keeping his frustration in check. "If the measure of justice is whether or not I was physically harmed, then we have set the bar far too low. The harm was in being treated as a suspect rather than a citizen. The harm was knowing that, despite my position, I was still seen as a threat." The questioning continued, but Marcus knew the real battle was happening outside the courtroom. Public opinion had been split. Some believed Mitchell should be fired, charged, and held accountable for his history of racial profiling. Others defended him, claiming he had simply been doing his job. There were those who said Marcus should be grateful the encounter hadn't ended worse, as if the absence of brutality somehow made the injustice more acceptable. In the end, the court's ruling was disappointingly predictable. While the judge acknowledged that the stop was unjustified, Mitchell was not fired. Instead, he was suspended without pay for 6 months and required to undergo additional bias training. It was a slap on the wrist, a bureaucratic gesture meant to create the illusion of accountability without real consequences. As Marcus walked out of the courthouse, reporters swarmed him with microphones. "Judge Carter, do you feel justice was served?" He paused, considering his words carefully. "Justice isn't served by a single verdict. It's served by changing the system that allows these incidents to keep happening." The city had moved on quickly, as it always did. The protests died down. The headlines faded. Mitchell would return to the force after his suspension, and Marcus had no doubt he would continue to police the way he always had. The system had protected him, just as Marcus had feared it would. But something was different. The video, the testimony, the public outcry, it had all left a mark. The mayor had been forced to propose new oversight policies. The city council had begun discussing independent reviews for racial profiling complaints. It was small, incremental change, but it was something. As Marcus sat in his office that evening, staring at the legal briefs stacked neatly on his desk, he felt the weight of what had happened. He had spent years believing in the law, trusting that the system could work, if only the right people were in place. But now he understood that the law wasn't just written in books. It was shaped by those who enforced it, those who challenged it, and those who refused to accept the status quo. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. The weight of the night still sat heavy on Judge Marcus Carter's chest, but he refused to let it crush him. The moment that should have been a routine drive home had turned into something far bigger, something that stretched beyond him, beyond one police officer, beyond one courtroom. It had become a symbol of a fight that was older than this nation itself. A fight for dignity, for fairness, for justice that was not conditional on skin color or social status. As he sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline, he thought about the countless black men who had not walked away from encounters like his. The names that had become hashtags. The cases that had never seen justice. He thought about his father, who had taught him to always keep his hands in sight if he was ever pulled over. About his mother, who had prayed over him every time he left the house, even after he became a judge. Even with all his accomplishments, all his power within the legal system, she had still feared for his life in ways other mothers never had to. His phone buzzed. A message from a stranger. "I saw your story. My son is 16, and I showed him the video. He asked me why a judge had to go through this. I didn't know what to tell him. Just wanted you to know we're standing with you." And Marcus exhaled slowly, setting his phone down. That was why he couldn't let this moment fade. He had been given a rare opportunity. His story wasn't buried, his voice hadn't been silenced. The world had watched, had listened. Now, he had to make sure they didn't forget. Outside, a protest was still taking place, the chants echoing through the streets. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. The words weren't just anger, they were a demand, a promise. A promise that silence would not be an option, that looking away was no longer acceptable. Marcus stood, his decision made. He could no longer be just a judge who ruled on cases. He had to be an advocate. A voice for those whose names were only remembered when tragedy struck. He would push for independent oversight, for changes in training, for laws that didn't just sound good on paper, but actually protected those most vulnerable to abuse. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about bringing down one officer. It was about breaking a cycle that had gone unchallenged for too long. It was about making sure that when the next black man got pulled over, he didn't have to fear for his life. That no title, no achievement, no level of success should be necessary to be treated with basic human dignity. He grabbed his coat, stepping into the night, walking toward the voices that refused to be quiet. Cameras flashed as reporters turned toward him, but he wasn't here to give a statement. He was here to stand. To fight. Because this wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning of something bigger.